Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our podcast. Today's episode is inspired by you, our amazing listeners.
That's right.
You suggest a topic or a book, and we dive deep to bring you valuable insights. So let's get started.
Let's do it.
We've had a lot of interest in understanding narcissism, lots of requests. So we're tackling that today by diving into Thomas Erikson's book, Surrounded by Narcissists.
Yeah, it's a popular one. And I think it's really crucial right up front to say what we're not doing here.
Okay.
We're absolutely not, handing out clinical diagnoses. That's for professionals. Requires proper evaluation.
Right. This isn't armchair psychology.
Exactly. What we are doing is exploring narcissistic behaviors, the patterns, the tendencies, and this idea of a narcissistic culture that Erikson talks about in the book.
So think of it more like getting informed, understanding the landscape.
Precisely. Helping you, our listener, become more aware of these behaviors. Maybe you see them in others, maybe sometimes little echoes in yourself. We all can, right?
For sure. And the goal is to make it genuinely useful, thought-provoking, but hopefully not, overwhelming.
Definitely. So Erikson draws this really vital line between narcissistic personality disorder, NPD, the clinical thing, and this broader spectrum of narcissistic behaviors.
And NPD itself, the book gives figures for that, right?
It does. He estimates it affects maybe 1% to 2% of people globally, which actually sounds small, but that's still 70 to 140 million people, a huge number.
Wow, okay. But then there's this other idea.
Right. This is where it gets interesting, culturally speaking. Erikson suggests that these narcissistic behaviors, not the full disorder, but might be way more common, especially, he says, in Western cultures.
How much more common are we talking?
Well, he points to international research suggesting figures closer to, 10%. Some even push it higher, maybe 15% or even 20%.
That's a massive difference, from 2% to potentially 20%.
It really is, and that jump is kind of the basis for this idea of a narcissistic culture maybe taking hold. Are certain traits becoming more visible, more acceptable even?
Okay, so that's our mission today then, to dig into what the book sees as these core traits and maybe touch on why they might be becoming more prominent.
Exactly. What are the building blocks of this behavior, according to Erikson, and what might be feeding it in society?
All right, let's get into it. Core characteristics, where do we start? What's number one on the list?
Well, a big one Erikson highlights is this constant need for validation from others. It's like an engine that needs constant fueling.
Okay, need for validation. How does that actually show up?
It can manifest in a few ways. One is being super sensitive to criticism. Like any feedback that isn't glowing praise can feel like an attack or just not enough praise.
Okay. So criticism equals you didn't praise me enough.
Sort of, yeah. And it connects to this constant need to broadcast achievements, talk about successes, drop names. It's all about getting that external approval to prop up their self-worth. The internal bar is just set incredibly high.
Right, like their self-esteem is outsourced almost.
Yeah.
Needs constant external input. Makes sense. What's another key trait?
Another really big one is this deep-seated belief that the rules, they don't really apply to them.
Oh, the special factor.
Exactly. They see themselves as exceptional, unique in a way that exempts them from the normal societal rules most of us follow.
So we're talking things like traffic laws or bigger stuff.
It can be anything, really, from speeding, like you said, to avoiding taking responsibility for mistakes, to just basic politeness seeming like a sort of pretense they don't need to maintain. It's a fundamental belief in their own special status.
Oh, so they genuinely think they're above the norm.
That's the idea presented in the book. And you can imagine this has a huge impact on relationships.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. How does it play out?
Well, they might be charming initially, draw people in, but the book suggests that real, genuine appreciation from others is rare in the long run.
Because they're unpredictable.
Yeah, that unpredictability, the feeling that they operate by different rules. It can be exhausting. It often leads to more superficial connections rather than deep, trusting bonds. People just don't feel that sense of solid ground.
Right, because the rules keep changing, depending on what the narcissist wants.
Yeah.
Okay. The book also mentions constant self-promotion. How's that different from just being confident?
It's about the focus. Erikson points to their language often dominated by I. I think, I feel, I did, I know. Because their worldview centers on their own perceived superiority, they constantly need to highlight it.
So less we and more me.
Definitely. It's about showcasing their qualities, their achievements, their important friends, their network. It's not just talking about yourself. It's this relentless performance to prove how great they are. Like, they're always the main character.
Always curating their own highlight reel. Got it. And that must tie into the feeling of entitlement, right?
Absolutely. They're deeply connected. This feeling that they deserve the best of everything is another cornerstone.
The best job, the best car, the best treatment.
All of it, the finest things. This constant search for perfection, needing to have the absolute best. It's a major driver. They operate with this almost childlike belief that they should get what they want simply because they want it and feel they're owed it.
So expecting maximum reward for minimum effort, taking up space, maybe even insulting people because, hey, they feel like it.
Yes, exactly. Those kinds of things. It's like normal constraints or considerations just don't factor in for them.
That sounds incredibly difficult to deal with if you're close to someone like that.
It really is. And it links back to that need for constant recognition we touched on earlier. Erikson says this can be really confusing for people around them.
Because it never stops.
Pretty much. This daily, almost hourly need for validation about their looks, their smarts, their success, how popular they are, it seems bottomless. Like their self-esteem tank has a leak and needs constant topping up from the outside.
Okay, that paints a clear picture. The last core trait you mentioned earlier was being deceitful and manipulative. Let's unpack that.
So the book suggests they often have this knack for spotting weaknesses or vulnerabilities in other people.
And they're not afraid to use them?
Not typically, no, if it helps them get what they want. Their general lack of concern for others' feelings makes the manipulation easier psychologically, and there's often this boldness to their deceit.
Why bold? Less fear of getting caught.
That seems to be the idea. Maybe they think they're too clever, maybe they think the consequences won't stick, or maybe, circling them back, they just believe the rules of accountability don't fully apply to them either.
Wow, okay, so these traits, the need for validation, thinking rules don't apply, self-promotion, entitlement, manipulation, they all kind of weave together, don't they?
Exactly. Erikson presents them as these interconnected pieces. These are the sort of foundational elements he identifies.
Okay. Now, you mentioned earlier the book distinguishes between being special and just being unique. Why is that difference important here?
It's a really interesting point. Erikson argues that statistically, almost everyone is unique. We all have our individual quirks and experiences.
Right, no two people are exactly alike.
Exactly. But being special, in the way Erikson defines it, means possessing qualities that create significant value for lots of people. Think Newton, Mandela, Marie Curie, people whose work or actions had this massive, broad impact.
Okay, so unique is individual, special is exceptional impact. How does that relate to narcissism?
Well, the book suggests that narcissists often build their whole self-concept around this claim of being special, even when there's no real evidence for that exceptional impact.
They just believe it, or they need others to believe it.
Both, probably.
Yeah.
But the point is, just believing you're special or being told it constantly doesn't actually make you special in that high impact sense. And for a narcissist, according to the book, facing the reality that they might just be unique but not exceptionally special, that can be a huge threat to their ego.
So it potentially triggers that sensitivity to criticism we talked about.
Hmm.
A core vulnerability, maybe.
Could be. It might underpin some of the defensiveness and aggression. Their whole self-image might hinge on maintaining that special status, even if it's just in their own head.
Okay. Now, the book also brings up the dark triad. Can you give us a quick rundown on that?
Sure. The dark triad isn't Erikson's term originally. It's from psychology, but he discusses it. It refers to 3 specific nasty personality traits that tend to overlap.
Which are?
Psychopathy, Machiavellianism, and narcissism.
Okay, break those down quickly.
Psychopathy is generally marked by coldness, a lack of empathy, impulsivity. Machiavellianism is all about being manipulative, calculating, exploiting others for personal gain. And narcissism, as we've been saying, is that grandiosity, entitlement, need for admiration.
And the danger is when someone scores high on all 3.
Exactly. The book warns that someone exhibiting strong traits from all 3 corners of the triad can be genuinely harmful to the well-being of people around them, especially, it notes, if they also lack inhibitions about aggression.
A pretty toxic combination.
For sure. Now, shifting gears slightly, Erikson uses this color system, reds, yellows, greens, blues, to talk about different behavioral styles. He uses reds and yellows as examples of how narcissists might target different types.
Right, I remember that from his other books. Can you briefly explain reds and yellows in his model?
Sure. So in his framework, reds are depicted as very driven, results-oriented, extroverted, often enjoy challenges, very fact-focused. Yellows are portrayed as more relationship-focused, optimistic, outgoing, seeking harmony and consensus. It's a simplified model, of course.
But useful for seeing manipulation patterns. How might a narcissist target a red?
Well, since reds value drive and action, a narcissist might try to impress them by showing extreme nerve, being really bold, breaking rules, taking big risks. To a red, this might initially look like admirable strength or decisiveness.
Mistaking recklessness for leadership.
Something like that. Plus, reds tend to be independent problem solvers, so they might be less likely to ask for help or realize they're being manipulated until it's gone quite far.
Okay, that makes sense. And how about the yellows, who focus on relationships and harmony?
They're vulnerable in different ways. Because yellows prioritize connection, a narcissist might target their relationships maybe by spreading gossip, creating drama, isolating them, or making them doubt their friends.
Undermining their support system?
Exactly, or using guilt. A narcissist might accuse the yellow of being selfish or not caring enough, which hits a yellow right where it hurts, while ironically, the narcissist is being incredibly self-centered themselves. It exploits their desire for harmony.
Wow, that's quite calculating. It really targets the core values of each type.
That's the idea. Now let's tackle a common assumption, that deep down, narcissists have fragile self-esteem. What does Erikson say?
Yeah, you hear that a lot, the bully who's secretly insecure.
Right. And Erikson acknowledges that sometimes bravado can mask insecurity, maybe from a tough past, but he argues it's often an oversimplification for true narcissists.
So they actually believe their own hype.
Largely, yes, according to the book's perspective. He points to self-perception tests, where narcissists consistently rate themselves high on things like assertive or dominant, but low on kind or generous. It suggests a stable, if skewed, self-image that genuinely values power over warmth. They like seeing themselves that way.
So the idea that they secretly hate themselves might be wishful thinking sometimes.
Erikson leans that way. He thinks many have a pretty cohesive, inflated self-image. They genuinely believe they're great.
Okay, that's a big shift from the common narrative. So if it's not deep insecurity driving them, how does the book frame the concept of love for a narcissist?
Well, it suggests their primary love object in themselves, but it's complicated, kind of a love-hate thing. They love themselves, but they hate that they aren't even better, even more perfect.
Wow, okay. And love for others.
Erikson defines genuine love as goodness, ethical behavior, doing things for others without expecting a direct payout. And he argues that narcissistic behaviors often show a real lack of this.
Like what kind of behaviors?
He gives the example of someone declaring you their soulmate incredibly early on. It feels intense, but it might be more about securing supply or control than genuine, deep affection and care forming naturally.
So relationships become transactional, about what the other person provides for them, admiration, status, whatever.
That seems to be the implication. Less about mutual care, more about soothing the narcissist's needs, which of course leads us straight into those manipulation tactics.
Right. The book lists quite a few. Let's talk about some key ones. Gaslighting is probably the most famous one now.
Yeah, gaslighting is huge, making someone doubt their own reality, their memory, their sanity. The book gives a simple example, like just flatly saying you're overreacting when someone expresses a valid feeling, dismissing their perception.
Undermining their confidence in their own judgment. Okay, what about love bombing?
Love bombing. That's the intense initial wave, over-the-top attention, praise, gifts, grand gestures, constant contact, making the person feel incredibly special, swept off their feet.
Sounds great, but there's a catch.
Always. It's usually followed by a sudden withdrawal, devaluation, or increased demands. It creates this intense bond and dependence quickly. The book warns, if it feels too good to be true early on, it might be.
Creates that dependency, then they pull the rug out. Nasty. What else?
Erikson mentions smoke screens. That's about deflection. You confront them about something, say cheating, and suddenly the conversation is all about how you're too jealous or insecure. They shift the focus off their behavior onto your flaws.
Classic misdirection.
Totally. Then there's arbitrary positive, negative feedback. Giving praise 1 minute, unexplained silence or criticism the next. It keeps the other person constantly guessing, trying to win back the positive attention, creating instability.
Keeping them off balance, hooked on trying to please.
Exactly. And the book lists others too, briefly. Pretending intimacy to get information they can use later, guilt-tripping, backhanded compliments, vague statements that sound important but mean nothing, minimizing their bad behavior, outright lies, being condescending, charm used strategically, forgetting inconvenient things, using rage to intimidate, playing the victim.
Wow, it's a whole toolkit.
It really is a wide array of ways to control and manipulate.
It really paints a picture of how damaging these behaviors can be in relationships. The book also links narcissism with aggression, right?
Yes, it cites some compelling research. One study found that people scoring high on narcissism reacted way more aggressively, even with threats, when they got negative feedback on something they did.
Compared to people who just had high self-esteem but weren't narcissistic.
Exactly. The non-narcissistic high self-esteem group didn't react that way. It suggests that the narcissistic ego is particularly fragile and prone to lash out when challenged.
And that anecdote about Nick the narcissist?
Oh yeah, that really illustrates the attention-seeking. He apparently didn't care if he was portrayed negatively on TV, just that he was on TV. The attention itself was the goal, good or bad.
Any attention is good attention.
Seems like it. And interestingly, the research also suggested that high self-esteem combined with narcissism was linked to more aggression than just high self-esteem alone.
So it's not just feeling good about yourself, it's that specific, inflated, entitled, low empathy combination that's combustible.
That's the conclusion drawn. It's a potent mix when that inflated view gets punctured.
Okay. Shifting perspective a bit, the book talks about collective narcissism, not just individuals, but groups.
Yeah, this is fascinating. The idea that entire groups, nations, political parties, organizations, even families can take on narcissistic traits collectively.
So a group acting like it's superior and entitled.
Pretty much. Demanding recognition, getting really angry at any criticism of the group, believing the world would be better if their group was in charge, that kind of thing.
A sense of group entitlement and superiority. And how do these groups tend to treat outsiders?
Often with prejudice and hostility. The book mentions they're quick to attack anyone seen as threatening the group's positive self-image. There was a study mentioned where people high in collective narcissism reacted really badly to a fictional exchange student who criticized their country.
So quick to take offense on behalf of the group, maybe overgeneralize.
Exactly. Very defensive of the group's image. And internally, these groups often share certain characteristics.
Like what?
Erikson describes them as often having a negative focus on perceived enemies, discouraging individualism in favor of groupthink, suppressing dissent within the group, and acting like the group has all the answers and is infallible.
Sounds like a recipe for poor decision-making and conflict with others.
It certainly can be, which leads us to wonder, where does Erikson think this rise in narcissistic traits, or this narcissistic culture, might come from?
Right, the origins. What's the theory in the book?
He traces some roots back to the 1970s, a cultural shift away from the stricter norms of the mid-20th century, towards more emphasis on, self-expression, individual fulfillment. The me decade, as it was called.
And the self-help boom played a role.
He connects it, yeah. Suggests the focus shifted towards boosting self-esteem, which felt maybe more achievable, more direct than the deeper, harder work of self-actualization.
He mentions Tom Wolfe's observation too, right?
Yeah, that people started spending more money on self-improvement courses and therapies rather than, say, trying to improve the world around them, a turn inwards.
Now, the book is careful to say that self-help itself isn't the problem, right? Personal responsibility, wanting to improve, those are good things.
Absolutely. It's not blaming self-help inherently. The potential issue is when that focus on the self becomes excessive, crowding out empathy and concern for others, taken to an extreme.
And then came social media. How does that fit into the picture?
Oh, massively. Social media seems almost custom-built for narcissistic tendencies, doesn't it? It's the perfect platform for constant self-promotion, for curating that perfect, idealized image.
The highlight reel effect we talked about earlier.
Exactly. Everyone's presenting this polished version, which can create this sort of social inflation, as the book calls it, a pressure to constantly perform, compete for likes, appear successful and happy all the time.
Which can feel pretty empty and also distort our view of reality.
For sure. And you see the extreme examples online, people bathing in money, the whole self-made narrative that sometimes ignores privilege or luck and can foster a kind of look out for number one attitude.
Yeah, it definitely provides an arena for those behaviors.
Yeah.
The book also listed how these tendencies might get normalized, even starting in childhood.
Right. It raises questions about parenting, specifically the potential impact of overvaluing children, constantly telling them they're special, amazing, the best, even when there's no real evidence of exceptional talent.
Sending the message that they're inherently superior.
That's the concern. Studies mentioned in the book link that kind of parental overvaluation to kids developing feelings of superiority and entitlement later on. Permissive parenting, with few rules or consequences, is also flagged as a possible factor.
And it's not just big things, even small stuff like
like kids' clothes with slogans like princess or boss or future CEO. Seemingly harmless fun, maybe, but the book questions if constantly reinforcing that sense of inherent specialness and entitlement from day one might have unintended long-term effects.
Subtle messages adding up. There's that restaurant anecdote, too.
Oh yeah, the kid demanding something, having a tantrum, and the parents immediately giving in. The lesson learned: make enough fuss, and your wants trump everything else. It teaches that their desires come first.
So these cultural trends, media, maybe even parenting styles could be inadvertently contributing. The book then circles back to self-esteem itself, calling it a potential double-edged sword.
Exactly. Healthy self-esteem is good, obviously. We need it. But Erikson argues that an excessive focus on boosting self-esteem, sometimes artificially, can backfire and actually feed narcissistic behaviors.
Is there evidence for that?
He shares a study that's pretty striking. Students had their self-esteem artificially boosted before a test. They ended up performing worse than the control group.
Worse? Really?
Yeah, worse. But they reported feeling much better about their performance.
Wow, so a total disconnect between perceived ability and actual competence. Feeling great, doing poorly.
Precisely. Which highlights the potential danger of focusing only on feeling good, rather than on actual skill development and realistic self-assessment.
So if an overfocus on self-esteem can be problematic, what's the alternative or the antidote, according to Erikson?
He champions humility.
Humility, having a modest view of your own importance.
Right. Not thinking less of yourself, but maybe thinking about yourself less. The book suggests real contentment often comes from shifting that focus away from the constant need for self-validation.
He mentions historical figures known for humility.
Yeah, people like Mandela, Mother Teresa, Martin Luther King Jr., Gandhi. Individuals known for service and generosity, not constant self-aggrandizement. He also touches on brain chemistry.
Oh, how so?
Mentioning serotonin's role in pride and how narcissists might become almost like attention junkies, constantly seeking situations that trigger that feeling of importance and validation.
So cultivating humility breaks that cycle. How do we do that practically?
The book suggests things like consciously reconsidering our material wants versus needs, maybe engaging in mindfulness or meditation practices, things that quiet the ego and connect us to something larger than ourselves.
Shifting focus outwards or inwards in a deeper way, rather than just outwards for validation.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance.
This has been incredibly insightful, a real deep dive into Erikson's perspective in Surrounded by Narcissists. Just to quickly recap for everyone.
Yeah, let's pull the threads together.
We've talked about that spectrum, from full NPD to the broader narcissistic behaviors. We've unpacked those core traits, the need for admiration, entitlement, manipulation.
We looked at their impact on relationships, this idea of a narcissistic culture, potential origins in societal shifts, social media's role.
Right, and the tricky nature of self-esteem versus the value of humility. It's a lot to think about.
It really is. Which brings us, I think, to a final, maybe provocative thought for you, the listener.
Okay, let's hear it.
Given everything we've discussed, the potential prevalence of these traits, their impact, what kind of culture and what kind of personal relationships do you actually want to help build?
That's a powerful question. It really turns the focus back on us. It encourages that self-reflection, doesn't it? Looking at our own behaviors, the messages we consume, the ones we put out there.
Absolutely.
So we really encourage you to keep exploring this. Maybe read the book, think about your own experiences, consider that balance between healthy self-regard and, excessive self-focus.
Because understanding these dynamics, both in others and potentially in ourselves, that's really the crucial first step towards fostering more genuine, more healthy connections.
Couldn't agree more. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. We'll see you next time.